Well, good evening, and it's good to be back to these Sunday evenings. I'm sure that you, like me, have been waiting for these Sunday evenings because you've had nothing better to do on a Sunday evening. Just getting a bit bored there. I'm sure. Well, it is. It's great to be back to our Sunday evening services, and we're continuing in our study in the book of Daniel. And since we've had a summer break, it'll be worthwhile. I thought about this for a while. It'll be worthwhile doing a quick recap on what has been covered so far, particularly for those that have either not been here and thinking what's all this about, and even for us that have forgot what's already gone on. Of course, the teachings are going to be on YouTube. Some of them are already on, but I just need a bit more time to start putting the rest on, but they will be up there soon. So I thought it'd be helpful again to remind you of why I wanted to do a study of the book of Daniel in the first place. As most, if not all of you are aware, we started these Sunday evening services back in March 2024. And we made the decision that we will dedicate our Sunday evening services to the teaching of Bible prophecy. We started with the basics. The first few sessions were intentionally dealing with what you could call introductory messages to Bible prophecy. And we intended to make the case of why it is important to study Bible prophecy, and implied that Bible prophecy is probably the most neglected subject taught in churches today, despite the fact that approximately 28% of the Bible was prophecy when it was first written. And another statistic that you may not be quite aware of is that the estimates are that over 80% of Bible prophecy has already been fulfilled. Now, I'm not good at maths, but I can work this out. That means that at least that there's probably just 20% left of Bible prophecy that is yet future. And quite a lot of that deals with post-rapture, stuff of the tribulation. And so it highlights the fact of the kind of days that we're living in. So as we sit here in church in the year 2025, and if one has an understanding of Bible prophecy and what the Bible says the world will look like in the last days, then it is becoming clearer by the day, and I mean that literally, by the day, it's becoming clear that the world is rapidly becoming ever more like what the prophetic scriptures say the world will look like in the last days. To quote a now well-known phrase, the world is not falling apart, the world is falling into place, exactly as the Bible foretells. And we call that phenomenon prophecy. So with that being said, it's our intention here as a church to concentrate on prophecy as part of our remit, if you like, not to neglect the fact that we want to teach the whole counsel of God, the whole scriptures. But you might not be. I made the case, but in our first session I did introduction to Bible prophecy, and one of the things I stated is that Bible prophecy is the second, if we go by volume, is the second most important teaching in the Bible, second only to salvation, which comes under the heading of soteriology in the theology of Bible prophecy. So only salvation is mentioned more often than the second coming. And so I made that case. So that is why it's important to study Bible prophecy. And for me anyway, it certainly helps me to see why things are the way they are. And I hope that through these meetings, as we continue, and as myself and James and others that we can bring in, that can share that and help you to see that things are falling into place, not falling apart. As I mentioned previously, when I prayerfully considered what topic or subject to address for these Sunday evenings, I thought the book of Daniel would be a good topic. Many people mention Daniel, and as I've studied and taught on Daniel on several occasions before, and so I thought I'd deal with the classic chapters, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Daniel 9. They're what's called the classic chapters, if you like. And so as I began to reacquaint myself with the book of Daniel again, I felt very strongly that the Lord would have me teach through the entire book of Daniel. And it quickly became apparent why. every chapter, indeed every situation and encounter that Daniel, in particular, and his three Hebrew companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, to give them their Hebrew names, by extension, every situation they encounter in most cases and in some way all has very practical applications for us living in today's world. And so we've already encountered many of them, and as I continue in Daniel, I try and highlight more as applications as we continue to go. So then, just to recap, in the first session I dealt with an extensive introduction to the book, and I asked and answered the question, what is the book of Daniel all about? What is the big picture? What is the 10,000 foot overview of Daniel? And it's basically about the times of the Gentiles. Simply put, the times of the Gentiles is that period of time that had never been revealed prior to Daniel, called a mystery. And that mystery is now revealed in Daniel and called the times of the Gentiles. It is a period of time when the nation of Israel will have no king reigning on David's throne, Zedekiah being the last. And the nation of Israel is going to be trampled down by various Gentile powers. And the nation of Israel will be bullied by the Gentile nations of the earth and trampled down until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That's not to be confused with the fullness of the Gentiles. For example, the times of the Gentiles and the fullness of the Gentiles are different. The times of the Gentiles will end when the Lord Jesus Christ will return as King of Kings and Lord of Lords at the end of the Great Tribulation, and he will rule and reign from David's throne. Indeed, Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 indicates that he will set up his kingdom through the Jewish people, and the times of the Gentiles will be over. And Luke says Jesus will be given the throne of his father David. And Matthew again says that Jesus will sit upon the throne of his glory. Therefore, the overall message of the book of Daniel is to reveal to the Hebrew nation that God has a time plan for that nation. And he is working to that time plan meticulously. And when we get to Daniel, it's often being said, and I concur with this quote, that the most amazing prophecy in the Bible is to be found in Daniel chapter 9. So when we get there, we'll be dealing with that. We also noted that the book of Daniel can be outlined as follows. Chapter 1 to 7 is the historical section, and chapters 8 to 12 is the prophetic section. We also noted that chapter 1 is in Hebrew, while chapters 2 to 7 are in what's called an Aramaic chiasm. Not an Aramaic, it's a chiasm, but it's in Aramaic. So it's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, which could be linked to like a Gentile language, because the prophecy in there are all linked to Gentile nations. We also noted that in chapter 1 is in Hebrew, and chapters 2 to 7 are in what's called this Aramaic chiasm. We are actually working our way through this chiasm, and in fact in the next session we will be dealing with Daniel 7, which will end that chiasm, and then we'll be into the prophetic section. So then, just to recap as quickly as I can, chapter 1 was itself an introductory chapter which dealt with King Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem and taking the Hebrews captive from Jerusalem and taking them 350 miles to the east to Babylon. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar led 3 besieges on Jerusalem. He first attacked Jerusalem in September in 605 BC. It was on this occasion that Daniel and his companions were taken to Babylon as captives. There were 2 other sieges by Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BC and 586 BC. The application for us from chapter 1 was that despite the fact that the Hebrews were taken from their homeland and now living in Gentile territory within pagan culture, they maintained their seriousness to the laws and customs of their homeland, and in their faithfulness to Yahweh, their God. Chapter 2 dealt with King Nebuchadnezzar having a troubling dream. The dream troubled him so much that he wanted to know the meaning of the dream, so he inquired of the so-called wise men of Babylon to first tell the king his dream and then interpret it. This leads to some commentators believing that Nebuchadnezzar didn't really forget the dream, but he used this occasion as a test to see whether these guys that he had inherited from his father, Nabopolassar, could actually cut the mustard, if you like. In other words, to see whether they really were qualified to do the job, or were they just frauds. As things transpired, it turned out to be an occasion for Daniel, with God's help, of course, to be able to tell the king his dream and give him the interpretation. The dream Nebuchadnezzar had was of a statue that consisted of 4 different materials: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Excuse me. The interpretation that Daniel gave was that each of these materials represented in different kingdoms that would arise after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom. In other words, the Babylonian kingdom was represented by the head of gold, and that would be conquered and replaced with the Medo-Persian Empire, represented by the breast and arms of silver. That would be conquered by the Greek Empire, represented by the belly and thighs of brass. The Greek Empire would in turn be conquered by the Roman Empire, represented by the legs of iron. It is interesting that Daniel referred to the Roman Empire as the 4th. There was no 5th empire. So the meaning we infer is that the dream Nebuchadnezzar had was a prophecy of 4 empires, Babylon being the first, and 3 future empires. Daniel would live to see 2 of these empires or kingdoms. In fact, he served in both. In Daniel 6, we will be dealing with that. He's now serving in Daniel 6. He's now serving in the second kingdom. The events of chapter 2, of course, catapulted Daniel to become, as it says in verse 48, ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. The chapter ended with verse 49, recording, "Then Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gates of the king." Chapter 3 centered around the famous fiery furnace event, and it is one of the classic Sunday school lessons that most, if not all, who have attended Sunday school have heard about 3 Hebrews named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to give them their Babylonian names. We saw in chapter 1 where they changed the names to Babylonian names instead of Hebrew names. It reveals how they refused to bow down and worship an idol or an image. It is despite them being taken as captives into a pagan Gentile environment, they remained faithful to Yahweh their God. And because of their faithfulness to their God, he provided and protected them through the ordeal of being thrown into a fiery furnace. I also highlighted in this chapter a very important issue that Christians face, and indeed we have all faced this issue in recent months or years, if I can say that. The issue, or rather the question is it ever right to disobey government? We've already mentioned and seen that these captives from Jerusalem are well trained and take seriously the law and customs of their homeland, including the Decalogue, and we did mention this when we went there. Decalogue is just like the 10 Commandments recorded in Exodus chapter 21-6. And let me just read to refresh your memory what it says. It says, "And God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I am the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." In other words, God says, you have no other gods before me, and no graven images. So, in other words, if they, as Hebrews, fulfill Nebuchadnezzar's dictate, they are violating the foundation of their relationship with God. God is monotheistic, meaning he is not interested in any competitors, and he alone is to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And the Jews for 800 years lived under the Mosaic system, and they understood that they are not to give credence to idolatry, and now these 3 Hebrew Jews are being forced into this circumstance legally. And of course, this is where the whole subject of civil disobedience comes up. And I will deal with that more at the end. The question really can be asked in this way. What to do, what do we do when the government forbids what God commands? Or what do we do when the government commands what God forbids? So just keep that in your mind. I'm going to come back to it at the end. Then we moved into chapter 4. And Daniel chapter 4 recounts King Nebuchadnezzar's humbling experience after God brings him low for his pride, in which he loses his human mind and lives like an animal for 7 years before God restores him to his throne and sanity. The chapter serves as a public acknowledgement of God's sovereignty and a warning against arrogance, emphasizing that the true power and blessings come from God himself. It revolves around a dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a frightening dream about a colossal tree that provides shade for the entire world. And an angelic watcher appears and declares that the tree must be cut down, its stump bound, and its human-like ruler driven from society. The king, after being unable to get answers from his magicians and sorcerers, asks Daniel if he can interpret his dream. And Daniel reveals that the tree symbolizes the king himself, whose power and pride have grown to reach the heavens. He warns Nebuchadnezzar that he will be dethroned and humbled for 7 years, living like an animal. Daniel advises the king to repent, stop his sinful pride, and acknowledge God as the true ruler of the world. However, 12 months later, after Nebuchadnezzar boasts about Babylon's greatness, from his palace, a voice from heaven announces his doom. His human mind is taken away, and he lives in the wilderness with animals eating grass like an ox. After 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar's sanity returns, and he praises God for his sovereignty and justice and mercy. The chapter concludes with Nebuchadnezzar's testimony to all peoples, recognizing that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and humbles those who walk in pride. We studied Daniel chapter 5 last time we were together. Daniel 5 is about Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar is now king of Babylon. It's a story where the king holds a lavish party and desecrates the holy vessels taken from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem during Nebuchadnezzar's besiege in 605 BC. This led to a mysterious hand to write on the wall, and Daniel interprets the writing, revealing God's judgment on Belshazzar for his arrogance and disregard for God's sovereignty. Consequently, Belshazzar is killed and his kingdom is taken by the Medes and Persians, with Darius the Mede taking the throne, this highlighting the consequences again of pride and the importance of acknowledging God's power. So a supernatural event occurs. It's a disembodied hand appears and writes the mysterious words on the wall of the palace. And Belshazzar is terrified, and who wouldn't be by this sight, and the guests are alarmed. And then the king, desperate, calls for his wise men and enchanters again to interpret the message, but none can read it. And then the queen, interestingly, the queen advises the king to send for Daniel, who is known for his wisdom. And then the message comes. Daniel interprets the words, "Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom. Tekel, you are being weighed in the balances and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians." The consequence of all this is Belshazzar's demise. That same night, Belshazzar was slain. And then Darius takes over. Darius the Mede receives his kingdom, marking the end of the Babylonian Empire. The chapter serves as a powerful illustration of how God judges pride, arrogance, and disrespect toward him. It underscores God's ultimate sovereignty over all the kingdoms of men, and his ability to place anyone he wishes over them. So that then is just a quick overview of the 5 chapters that we've covered so far. And so this evening then we come to Daniel chapter 6. But I just want to refer you back to this chiastic structure. It'll help, I think, by giving you a kind of visual illustration form of where we have been and where we are going. So very quickly, this chiasm. It's laid out as follows. Chapter 2, so if you start on the outside, chapter 2 lines up with chapter 7, which we'll be dealing with next week. And the theme is Gentile history. Chapter 3 lines up with chapter 6, which we'll be dealing with tonight, and the theme is protection. And chapter 4 lines up with chapter 5, and the theme in both those chapters was revelation to a Gentile king. One revelation to Nebuchadnezzar and the other to Belshazzar. So then, we come to Daniel chapter 6. and verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these three presidents, of whom Daniel was first, and the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. So one of the first tasks or responsibilities was for Darius was to reorganize the newly conquered kingdom of Babylon. He appointed 120 princes to rule over the kingdom of Babylon, and he put them under 3 presidents. Continues in verse 3. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So the king planned to make Daniel responsible for the administration of the entire kingdom. Now you can imagine how that went down with those outsiders. Daniel is kind of an outsider here. He's a Hebrew, and these are all pagan, Persians and Medes. So you can see how there would have been a tension there. They wouldn't have been too pleased about it. And we're going to find out exactly what they did feel about it as we continue. Verse 4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the councillors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree, sign the writing, that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. So the 2 presidents and the 120 princes sought some basis on which to accuse Daniel in his administrative work. And they were probably jealous of his position and resented him because he was a Judean, which is, verse 13 spells out their jealousy for us. But they could find no fault at all in which to accuse Daniel. He was utterly trustworthy and diligent in discharging his responsibilities. You might say Daniel was a model employee. Immediately we are faced with a challenge. How would you, or how would I for that matter, measure up to that type of scrutiny? People looking at our lives, the way that we live, we say, we're Christians, we love God, we obey God's laws, and yet they look at us with scrutiny. Would that stand up? It's often being said, you might know this, if you've been a Christian of any length of time, it says, if you were charged, this is quite personal, if you were charged for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Very serious thought. So the plot thickens. Realising that they could not pin anything on Daniel regarding his character, they decided to set a trap for Daniel with regards to his religious practices. It is clear that Daniel's loyalty and devotion to God was well known. Remember, Daniel has been around for a long time. He is probably in his early 80s at this stage, and if you look at this chart, it's a bit small, but that kind of, if you go through the different chapters, it tells you what age Daniel was in these ages. And in this situation, he's probably in his early 80s, somewhere around 83 or so. And in the, I've showed you this before, the Bible Knowledge Commentary, it has this to say regarding verses 6 to 9. It says, the 122 leaders devised a plot. Daniel was certainly outnumbered. They suggested to the king Darius that he, the king, be made the sole object of worship for 30 days. Now, either the 122 got the others to agree to the plan, including all the prefects, advisors, governors, or the 122 merely said the others agreed. Saying they all agreed in verse 7 was wrong. In other words, they lied, because they certainly didn't discuss that with Daniel. All prayer was to be addressed to the king in recognition of his power in the religious realm. The penalty for rebelling against his religious authority was to be deaf by being thrown into a den of lions. The commentary continues. Darius, no doubt flattered by the adulation that he would receive, consented to the plot and signed it into law, which, according to the Medo-Persian custom, was irrevocable. Once it's been signed into law, that's it, can't be changed, no matter who you are. We continue, verse 9. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows open in his chamber toward Jerusalem. He kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. The decree that Darius had signed into law quickly became public knowledge. But Daniel, knowing the decree, followed his customary practice, just as he had done before, of going to his room and praying towards Jerusalem 3 times a day. It's interesting to know what Daniel prayed. We're told Daniel gave thanks to God. I mean, that is amazing, and it's a lesson for us that, when we go, before we start mourning to God about what we're not happy about, we should give him thanks. And there's a lot to be thankful for. The fact that we just have breath in our lungs for a start, and the things that we do take sometimes for granted. So we need to thank God. So it's interesting then that Daniel gave thanks. And verse 11 then says, the men came near and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And it's a pattern that we should all practice. First, give God thanks. Again, there's much to it to be thankful for. Then make our supplications to God. Now, I recently began to focus and think about this word supplication. It was something that I heard just recently somewhere that started me thinking about this. The word simply means asking God to supply what we need, either in a general sense or sometimes in a more immediate sense. And it really helped me focus on what I was asking from God, especially if I wasn't sure exactly what I needed. And so I've started in my prayer life now to begin to focus more on asking God to supply me with what I need to be able to live a life that is honouring and pleasing to him, rather than asking God to give me the things that I think I need to live that way. Sometimes we pray things and think, that if I have that'll help me in my Christian life, or if I have that. When sometimes, and this is just me personally sharing, I've started to think more now intently when I'm coming to pray, what is it I need? And sometimes I don't know what I need. So I ask God to supply me what I do need. And that's what supplication is. And God says, yeah, ask away. And he'll give us what we need, not what we want. So that's just personal, back to Daniel. And in verse 12, it says, then they came, this is the guy, they came and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. So the accusation then was soon made against Daniel by his opponents before Darius, who had issued the decree. Darius now found himself bound by his own law. He said the decree stands. It's interesting to note that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king in the Babylonian Empire, was above the law. He slayed who he wanted and kept alive who he wanted. Whereas Darius, the Mede, was bound by the law. This was intimated in the contrast between the gold and the silver of the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So we continue in verse 13. It says, then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee. The words are interesting. It says to the king, that Daniel, him there, they obviously resented him. That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he laboured till the going down of the sun. That's very interesting. Laboured all day till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, know, O king, that the Lord of the Medes and Persians it is that no decree or statute which the king establisheth may be changed. Then the king commanded that they be brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. So upon hearing their accusation against Daniel, whom they derisively belittled as one of the exiles from Judah, Darius was greatly distressed. Though Darius knew that he was bound by the law, he made and sought some way in which to rescue Daniel from the penalty of the law that he incurred. But finding it impossible to do so, he gave the order that Daniel be thrown into the lion's den. And as he was thrown into what seemed to be certain death, the king said, May your God whom you serve continually deliver you. Whether Darius knew about God's deliverance of Daniel's three friends from the fiery furnace in Nebuchadnezzar's day is not known. It's not mentioned. It doesn't say. Yet Darius' statement expressed a desire that Daniel be spared. Now, he certainly wanted Daniel spared, for he obviously appreciated his administrative abilities. Perhaps he had been impressed with Daniel's confidence in God. Verse 17, it says, And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his signet, and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, and passed the night fasting, and neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. I recall Chuck Misler mentioning about this. He says he thinks that Daniel had a better night than the king did. and obviously, but the king, he was up all night and didn't want any music playing, and he was obviously deeply upset. And so they placed a stone then, so that Daniel couldn't escape. A stone was placed over the mouth of the cave, and then sealed by a royal seal. And again, the Bible knowledge commentary says this. It says, besides the side opening of the den, the lion's den, perhaps underground cave, there may have been an opening at the top. The seal, which is an impression made in clay by an image on a ring, would inform others that the stone was not to be tampered with in an effort to free Daniel. Reluctantly, the king confined Daniel to the den. So we continue then in verse 19. It says, Then the king arose early in the morning, and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel, verse 21, Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths. They have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded that they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, forever they came at the bottom of the den. So at dawn then, the king, after a sleepless night, hurried to the lion's den in anguish, probably over finding Daniel consumed. Darius had hoped against all hope that the elderly statesman might have been rescued by God whom he served. And Daniel replied that God had in fact kept him unharmed because of his flawless life, because he trusted in God. God's angel, Daniel said, had kept the lion's mouth shut. Discovering that Daniel was still alive, Darius, of course, was overjoyed and had him lifted up from the lion's den immediately. This experience illustrated for Darius the validity of faith in God and his power to control circumstances and deliver those who trusted him. And that speaks to us too. No matter what we face, and dark days may be coming, whatever we face, we just trust in God. And he can do all things. And we continue now and finish from verse 25. Then the king Darius wrote unto all peoples and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who have delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we see then a similar instance happen with Nebuchadnezzar after he had an encounter with God, and he made a decree also declaring God's greatness and goodness. The one who by this decree had been reverenced for a month, namely Darius, as God, being reverenced by God, making petitions and prayers to him, now made a proclamation that all subjects of his nation, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language must fear and reverence Daniel's God. This was an amazing turnaround on Darius' part. The reason for this, Darius wrote, is that Daniel's God lives. He is the living God, whereas the gods of the Medes and Persians were dead idols. This God is eternal, and his kingdom is indestructible, and he intervenes in people's affairs and delivers those who trust him. He works by miraculous power, signs and wonders, to perform his will, including the miraculous delivery of Daniel. Such a God is truly to be reverenced and worshipped. In spite of the opposition of the administrators, Daniel was honoured and lived during the reigns of Darius here, and we'll find out next time, and Cyrus. And next time we'll be in chapter 7, the chapter of visions of the four beasts. Now, I just want to go back to what I said earlier about civil disobedience. Is it ever right to ignore a government dictate? And I shared this when we went through it, but I just thought for those that weren't there to share it once again. Now, Romans 13 says that we are to obey the government. You know, they're appointed by God for good, and you know, as long as you're not doing anything God, you've no need to fear. But there are some times when they overstep the mark. And so what we have to do when that happens is we need to have a clear conflict. If there's a clear conflict between the laws of man and of God, we need to make sure that if the government says something that goes directly against God's word, we need to know where we stand and if it's right to disobey. And this is, by the way, this is from Andy Woods when he did some teaching on this. So first thing we need to do, or one of the things we need to do, is exhaust all creative legal remedies. And if there's no way out, you exhaust them all first. So it's not the first thing to say, oh, they say that, so I'm not going to do it because God says this. No, we seek to do it respectfully, you know, and in a way that, you know, surely we can come to some agreement even. The third one is a willingness to pay the consequences. Now, we when we dealt with this with the three Hebrews in the fiery furnace, they were willing to pay the consequences. Yeah, okay. And they said clearly, "Let be known, O King, we're not going to bow down to you." So you know, and then the final one is the always maintain the respect of civil authorities. They did that. They said, "O King, we're not going to bow down because we worship our God." And that's, as Christians, this is what we need to model our lives on. Now, sometimes we can be a bit rebellious and say, look, you know, I don't agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't agree with within government, and particularly in the area of taxes. I mean, to be quite honest, be careful what I say, remembering being called. There's a lot of taxes I think that are immoral. They're immoral. It's like double taxation and stuff. But we are to pay our dues, render unto Caesar, and unto God what is God's. So we need to be living according to the laws of the land which we live in. But if there is ever a conflict, then we need to go through all these stages and make sure that we, you know, we're abiding by them. And if there comes a time when we can say, yep, we believe that goes against what God's command is, and in Acts, I remember it was Paul and Barnabas, even told the Jewish elders, they said, well, you decide what you do with us, but as for us, we must obey God rather than men. And that's what we do. We must obey God rather than men. And so that's just kind of a fly through Daniel 6. And next time when we get into Daniel 7, there's some really good stuff there. Remember again that Daniel 7 links up with Daniel 2. So that'll be interesting. We have one more song to sing. And Emma will put that on. I forgot what it is, so Emma will remind us. Oh Lord, my